So welcome everyone. I'm Lauren Durden from the David J. Anderson School of Management, and today's presentation we have David Anderson. We also have Anna Radzakowska connected. She's going to help me answer some of the questions coming into the Q&A today.
Hello.
So David, whenever you're ready.
All right, let me get rid of some of this noise on my screen here. Okay, well, welcome. So some of you we saw the poll, so perhaps 70–80% of you are familiar with our training, our Kanban guidance, and some of you may have seen me blogging back in April of last year, about 6 weeks into the current crisis. And some of my blog posts were about the way that I was leading our business, the changes we were making as a consequence of coronavirus and the lockdowns. And some of them were a reflection on how work has to change, and some observations that people were already beginning to burn out from being constantly on screen like this. And we've spoken to some of you over the last 6 to 9 months when you've been attending our training. And we hear stories like some of you are on Zoom or Teams or some similar technology 11 or 12 hours per day. We've spoken with people who have an employer who has installed software on their machine to track the amount of time they spend logged in and therefore working, supposedly. And many people we've spoken to, as I predicted back in April of last year, are feeling very burned out from being in a world of locked down, working from home, and trying to juggle the rest of their lives. And continuing to work, trying to create the virtual experience of how they worked when they were in physical presence at their office. So we want to look at an alternative today. The idea that your organization is a network, a very large network of interconnected services. And those of you who are sitting at home, working from home remotely, you need to cast yourself as a service of one. You need to be working in a service-oriented organization that knows how to compose customer-facing services, orchestrate them together rapidly, and use the services of the large number of individuals who are working remotely. Now I need to figure out how to actually change the slide. Okay. So in the picture here is Yves Morieux, who is a senior partner with Boston Consulting Group and the head of their research at Henderson Institute. And he's been studying the same phenomenon and has posted a number of articles. Some have appeared in mainstream media and newspapers. Some have appeared on the BCG website. He's given a number of speeches, conferences. He was a keynote speaker at our Lean Kanban Central Europe in 2019. And more recently, he said things like the pandemic has exposed the real work. And he's made the comparison that an office is a container for work, and people would travel to the office, they would work together in the office, and the work was contained largely within the office, even though we have many devices nowadays for connecting when we're not in the office. But the office was the container. And the last 20 years had largely been about the concept that we should be co-located in order to be productive and to be efficient. And his research in the last 9 months has demonstrated that this really wasn't the case, and that as soon as everyone was working from home, this exposed the reality that a lot of what was going on in offices wasn't necessarily real work, and it wasn't producing the productivity and the efficiency that people were claiming. It was offering us a feel-good factor and masking the fact that the work wasn't happening fast enough. Right? That the reality of the coronavirus pandemic is that we're not going back to the way things were before the pandemic. And consequently, the office as a container of work is history. So in Yves' own work and the guidance that he publishes for BCG to their clients is focused on, if you're a large employer with lots of office space, what are you going to do with it in the future? But the office as a container of work is history. And therefore, as I blogged back in the spring, we have to realize the truth. There is no team in a post-coronavirus world. That what we have are a very large number of individuals remotely working from home. And what we need to encourage is for those individuals to be able to cooperate and collaborate together as needed on the real work. All right, so colocation felt good, it was fun, but it masked the truth that real cooperation wasn't happening. And why do we know this? Because in the organizations that are mature enough to measure it, and that's not terribly many, if we've got 150 of you out there right now, my guess is from our historical data, maybe 5 of you are actually capable of instrumenting your organization for flow efficiency. The rest of you aren't, but we can be pretty sure it's a low number, because people who are good enough to be able to measure it can tell us that it's 1%, 2%, 5%, 8%. If we're lucky, it's a little bit higher than that. So if flow efficiency is very low, and the whole idea of colocation was that everyone that you need to have is instantly available to you because you all sit together in the same container, then it was a myth. The whole colocation thing is a big myth. It's fun, but it's not actually serving customers better. It's not producing better economic outcomes. It is not improving the global economy. It's not creating efficiency or productivity or generating wealth. The sort of wealth that over the last few centuries has made us very comfortable as human beings. We no longer have to worry about whether we have enough food to eat. There is an excess of food and it's in the grocery store just down the street. So that type of improvement, and to put some numbers on this, in the 20th century, manufacturing industry improved productivity by 200 times. In the 20 years since then, it's improved productivity by another 4 times. That's 800 times. So something that used to cost $800 to make in 1900 now costs $1 to make. That's the productivity improvement that has happened because manufacturing industry has flow efficiency numbers that are in the 80-90% range. While knowledge workers, professional services workers have flow efficiency that's typically 1-2%, maybe 8% if you're lucky. And if the numbers are higher than that, it's usually because people are not measuring them correctly, or they're measuring them very narrowly. They're measuring them in perhaps the center of a workflow and not from when the customer asked for something until when they actually took delivery. So your entire organization's a network of services, and the core idea with Kanban is you build a Kanban system for every service. That how you scale Kanban is to do more Kanban, and you scale it out in a service-oriented fashion around your organization. Wherever you can see a service, you build a Kanban. So if we have individuals working from home, if they can offer a service of one, they should have an individual Kanban. Right? So realizing this truth, that co-location, we're all teams, it's all very identity related. It was a focus and an emphasis on who we are. And when we don't have that any longer, when we don't have the co-location, when there really are no teams, then we have to move the emphasis from who to why. We need to use purpose to drive the alignment. So communicating purpose fosters alignment. People working remotely all understand why they're doing something, what the outcome should look like. They're capable of cooperating together to produce it without the high bandwidth communication that you get from co-location. Right, so we need to move the focus from worker productivity to relational productivity. This term Yves Maru uses, relational productivity. We call it flow efficiency. Relational productivity is the idea that if I'm working remotely with a bunch of you who are all remote, then we manage to communicate and our relationships produce productivity. We take out the delay. We improve the flow efficiency. We work smoothly and effectively. There is flow in the organization. And the resilient organizations that will perform best as the economy recovers in the post-pandemic world will be the organizations that master relational productivity. Now, it so happens that there's a precedent in the annals of the agile movement for a service-oriented approach to relational productivity. We just have to rewind back 24 years into the late 1990s. And one of Southeast Asia's largest banks, United Overseas Bank in Singapore, where a number of people, including me, were involved in building a very large-scale banking application. And that project, it doesn't sound terribly big. It was 50 to 60 people, about 2 years, and about $20 million. But it outperformed. It produced more functionality that worked better and integrated the bank's lending services from consumer lending, $500 overdrafts on your checking account, through commercial and corporate lending, to the scale where Cathay Pacific Airlines might roll in and say, we want to buy a fleet of Boeing 747s and we need to borrow the money. All of that integrated into one bank lending system. Citibank had tried to do the same thing. They'd spent 5 times more money and 2.5 times more time on it, and they had failed. So it was the sort of project that a typical Western bank would call a $100 to $200 million project. They would have had several hundred people working on it for 3 to 5 years. And at the time, a relatively small regional bank in Southeast Asia outperformed them. And we did that by developing a method called feature-driven development. I noticed that there's a bug on the slide there. So this is proven in large-scale enterprise application development, banking and telecom industries. It produced very superior economic results and exceptionally fast time to market, given the context that we're working with. Now, the 1990s was about object-oriented technology, and I apologize to anyone who's on this call who's not a programmer, software engineer. There will be some of you who will not understand anything in the next 2 or 3 slides, so please bear with me. The rest of you might vaguely recognize the concepts in object-oriented technology, and this is known as a class diagram. Now, unlike other agile methods, feature-driven development had a whole different value system. And one of those values was that individual programmers owned sections of the code. They owned specific classes in the object model. In those days, applications were client-server applications, and they typically had 3 layers: a user interface, business logic, object-oriented model, typically in a language like Java, and then some persistent storage or database in the back end. And each of the programmers, of which there were 25 to 30 on this project, owned pieces of the code. So if a feature came along and that feature needed some software developed in a specific area of the code, a specific class file, that programmer had to be involved in doing it. Now, the reason for this was that the object-oriented concepts of loosely coupled and highly cohesive, and therefore very easily maintainable code that doesn't require a lot of refactoring later on. Very clean code straight out of the box. And the idea that the owner of a particular piece of the model would really understand the cohesive nature of the functionality that that particular class was meant to perform. So when a feature comes along, in this case, to calculate the total for a sale, perhaps in a retail application, then a lead programmer is appointed to be in charge of that feature, and usually a batch, small batch, 5, 10 features at a time. And they will have some knowledge of the architecture, they'll work with the architects, they'll have some knowledge of the existing code base, and just using their intuition, they'll have a reasonably good idea which parts of the code base will be affected by a given feature. They will then invite the programmers who own those parts of the code, the class owners, as it says on this diagram, to come together and design the features and then write and test the code. And for that batch of features, they will be together as a team, and 1 to 2 weeks later, they will have completed the work and the team disappears. It's gone. There's no concept of fixed teams like you might find in extreme programming or Scrum. So to use our modern Kanban language, the team lead is the feature delivery manager, the service delivery manager for some set of features, and the individual programmers are service providers. They provide the service of writing and testing code in specific class files in the code base. And we see here that we have to collect together 3 or 4 individuals to form the feature team. Only one feature shown in this diagram, but typically it would be 5 to 10 in a batch of features. So every programmer offered a service, every team lead was a service delivery manager, and services were composed dynamically. They existed for perhaps 2 weeks and then gone. Then a new batch scheduled, new team lead appointed, that person assembles a new team, composes them together out of the existing class owners. With feature-driven development, if coronavirus had happened in 1998, the development could have continued at maybe not quite the same pace that it did in the office as a container in Singapore, but still very rapidly, because it was already a service-oriented organization. It was already robust and resilient to an impact like a pandemic. So to make this work, it's not practical to say everyone has to change to doing feature-driven development and let's roll the clock back in technology innovation to the 1990s and object-oriented programming on client-server applications. That's ridiculous. So the challenge now is for each of you to be able to figure out, how do you define yourself as a service of one working in the organization that you work in? Now, some places it might be easier than others. If you work in an advertising agency, for example, you might be a copywriter, and the service you offer is that you write slogans, you write text, you write descriptions of things, you write copy. You might be a picture editor, and the service you provide is that you scan through pages and pages of stock photography and you select images for use in a campaign. You might be a graphic designer, and your job is to edit those images and produce variations, mashups, perhaps to produce text and graphic layout. You might be a photographer. You might be a casting agent. You might be an account manager, effectively a service delivery manager for a customer-facing campaign request. Or you might be a producer, someone who is effectively a service delivery manager, for example, for a photo shoot or for a print advertising layout, the copy, the imagery, and the graphic design. So some of you will be in roles that are suitable for that service delivery manager role, the person whose job it is to figure out the work the customer has asked for, how does it break down, and where do we send it in the organization. And something like an advertising agency may already be very service oriented and a lot of individuals who do individual work. And therefore it's easy and straightforward. And for others of you, it may not be so obvious, and it will take some thinking to figure out, how do I define my job as a service of one? What's the deliverable? What am I being asked for? What do I deliver back? How does it integrate? Who do I need to cooperate with? Who might I need input and collaboration from? Now, if we took that service-oriented approach that we see in feature-driven development, and then we said, okay, let's take that and add this newer thing that came along 10 years later or so, Kanban, and merge the two things together, what happens? Well, we start limiting the work in progress and pooling work. We don't necessarily schedule batches anymore, it's single piece flow. And if we have programmers as individual service providers, then we have individual Kanban boards. And this is an example of one. Individual Kanbans described at different levels of fidelity in the Kanban maturity model book. In fact, to be an effective service of one, this is not personal Kanban with fridge magnets and a Kanban board on the kitchen fridge for your children to do their homework. If you're a professional working in a large enterprise, working remotely, offering remote services, you have to be able to cooperate with many other people, many other services in the organization. You're part of the network. And if that organization is to produce customer satisfaction and delivery within expectations, quality within expectations, and do that at scale and do it regularly, then you're looking at an organization that will be maturity level 3 or 4 in our organizational maturity model. So what does an individual Kanban look like in that world? It's not just a simple to do, doing and done. That's way too trivial. That's maturity level 0 or 1. It has to have a lot more sophistication. And those practices are already defined in the Kanban maturity model. These Kanban practices for high maturity performance. And we have a list of them here. Learn to see service provision even at the individual level. We can teach that to you. analysis of customer valued work requests. Now, inside the organization, who's asking me? What are they asking me for? Who's the customer? What's the deliverable? What service am I providing? And then learn to develop triage discipline. Triage discipline, the concept of what we should do now because it's urgent and critical. What should wait until later? And if so, when? That's a scheduling problem. And what should we not do at all because it's not particularly valuable and we're never going to get to it because we don't have capacity? We need to learn to sequence and schedule work using some risk analysis framework. And we need to understand how to serve work at different rates, different speeds, different classes of service effectively, based on the cost of delay, the urgency and the criticality of an item. And we have all of those tools already available for service delivery Kanban in the workplace. We just need to figure out how to apply those at the individual level. And of course, we've done that for you. We can teach that to you. Then dependency management becomes an even greater problem, a greater challenge. And my experience is agile people are very scared of dependencies. They know it hurts them. They know it causes them to break their promises. They know it gives them a headache with planning. And my observation of the solutions in the agile movement for dependency management are they're incredibly expensive, they're incredibly fragile, and they don't really work very well. And the frustration for me when I was teaching 5, 6, 7 years ago, people would say, teach us about dependency management. How do we manage dependencies with Kanban? And I'm like, why is this even a question? Because the Kanban method already had the solution for that built in, which was the idea that your organization is service oriented. You build a Kanban system for every service, and you use the operations review as the feedback mechanism to understand the interaction between the services, and you make adjustments. You adjust WIP limits, you adjust capacity allocations, you adjust classes of service, you adjust resource and staffing levels, and so on and so on. And therefore, the organization evolves into something that naturally manages dependencies very easily. But it turned out that wasn't a psychologically acceptable solution. So in response to that, we developed more explicit dependency management solutions using things like capacity tokens, which are basically just Kanban, dynamic reservation boards and classes of booking. And this material's described in the Kanban maturity model. We teach it in our enterprise services planning class and some of it in our Kanban for design and innovation class. Then we need Kanban metrics. We need things to hold people accountable. We need ways of stressing the organization to catalyze evolutionary change and improvements. And we have the Kanban cadences, the service delivery review, the risk review, the operations review, strategy review, as feedback mechanisms to drive improvement. And all of these things apply to individual Kanban and you as a service of one as part of a wider enterprise. The Kanban practices in the Kanban maturity model, more than 150 of them mapped against the 7 levels in the model. And most of the enterprise services planning practices are not on this picture. This has been deliberately simplified because many people are working in organizations that are still maturity level 0 or 1. So to sum up here, we have to realize the truth. The office as the container of work is history, and consequently the co-located team is no longer exists. It's gone. And given this, the effective enterprises of this decade will be the ones that master relational productivity, that learn how to cooperate together on real work as work from home individuals. And the real work is customer valued deliverables that they learn to cooperate better and produce high flow efficiency despite the fact they're not co-located. The blowing up the office and spreading everyone to their homes, their home offices, their kitchen tables, gets people to focus on the real work and the real cooperation that's required. And my prediction is that flow efficiency in this decade will improve dramatically because we don't have co-location. That co-location has caused people to be distracted and not focused on what was really important. So individual Kanban is going to allow you to define what you do as a set of services, to view yourself as a service of one, and to apply all the Kanban practices that we already know and love from enterprise implementations to your individual service of one, and to participate in a highly effective, high maturity enterprise that delivers superior economic performance. Right. This is the decade of business resilience. It's about recovering from taking the knocks that all of our businesses have suffered as a consequence of the pandemic, rather than perhaps the agility movement, which is about exploiting opportunities that might come along in an otherwise very comfortable world that we were all living. And business resilience comes from service orientation and an ability to rapidly orchestrate and compose services into new customer-facing services, and allow people who are working from home to have a well-defined understanding of their work, a well-defined service interface that allows consistency for them while the business can change very rapidly. The future of organizational design is service-oriented. And for me, it's not the future. We were doing this 24 years ago at a large bank in Singapore. So to learn more about this and to become an individual Kanban practitioner, we have a training class coming up. And Lauren will be very happy to hear from you. We have a discount code available for you for those who've attended this webinar. And Anna and I will be teaching the first of these classes, teaching you how to develop an enterprise-worthy individual Kanban system. So that's it for the presentation, and we have time for some questions, perhaps. Lauren.
Okay, thank you, David. So this first question came in quite early. So it's, how much of the lack of flow is due to suboptimal culture rather than a work framework?
I don't think we have an answer to that question. What we have is the evidence that things are not flowing. And is it likely that the culture doesn't value flow? Probably. So is there a cultural element to it? Yes, certainly. However, when you have an organizational design that assumes that because people work together, they're instantly available, and you focus on creating this mythical thing called the cross-functional team that has all the functions that you need on the team sitting together, co-located in theory so that they're instantly available to you. If that was working, flow efficiency numbers would be dramatically higher than they are. And if you've given it 20 years already and the numbers haven't improved, it's a reasonable assumption to say it was an interesting concept, but it doesn't appear to be working. So get out of denial and move on.
Carl says, interesting. I was going to ask about purpose. Is this linked to driving self-organization? Oh, sorry, to driving self-organization. I might have said it out of order.
So self-organization can happen if people have a shared purpose. How do you get them to have a shared purpose? Well, they all need to take responsibility and accountability. Do you have that culture? We have 4 chapters in the Kanban maturity model book on organizational culture, an entire section of a 5-day training on organizational culture. The circumstances for self-organization require that you have a liberal, high-trust environment that's typically quite tight-knit, that the social cohesion is high. So you need tight-knit organization where with high trust, that's liberal and innovative, where people are individually committed to taking responsibility and accountability, and as a group they're willing to share responsibility and accountability. And if that's the case, you drop a purpose into that group and they'll all swarm on it and work together quite happily. If you don't have the right culture, you have to replace the self-organization with leadership. And leadership creates the social cohesion that causes people to follow and fall into line and create alignment, and in some cases to take direction so that they know what to do. So it's a very cultural thing. It's not an organizational structure thing, but you're not going to have self-organization without purpose. But the opposite isn't true. The fact that you have purpose, you're instantly going to have self-organization, another agile myth.
Okay, another question. How does feature-driven development relate to behavior-driven development?
I have no idea.
Okay, we'll move on. Michael's question, he says, awesome presentation. You've really hit the nail on the head. Can you elaborate a bit on how to go about flow efficiency metrics in the knowledge environment?
Well, we've documented that pretty well in all sorts of places, and we teach it in class. But the bottom line is you need instrumentation from when a customer asked for something to when it was delivered, and you need to be able to track the states of the work and cleanly identify when you're working on something versus when you're not. But from the point of view of a general average, this is how I do it with clients. And recently I was in the headquarters of one of the 2 biggest banks in the Iberian Peninsula, in the Madrid headquarters, with a collection of sort of middle ranking executives. Recently, it was last summer sometime. And they spent a long time talking about stuff and didn't seem to be getting anywhere in the meeting. And I said, look, time out here. What is it you guys are afraid of? And they responded and said, we're not fast enough. So I had to reinterpret that for them a little bit, and they nodded. So they're not fast enough in terms of operational delivery, and they're not fast enough in terms of innovation and time to market with new products and services. Therefore, they're not fast enough at neutralizing, for example, fintech startups. Okay, so we understand this problem. Why are you not fast enough? Almost certainly they don't have flow efficiency. So I asked them some of the problems they like to solve, and they were talking about basic stuff like opening bank accounts faster. Someone applies for a credit card. We have to do some credit analysis on them and decide whether we give them the credit card or not, what the credit limit should be, etc., etc. Okay. And how long is that taking? And they told me, and I said, okay, for a moment, just imagine that the King of Spain's private secretary calls up right now and says, you know, the king's going on a trip and he really feels that it would be convenient if he had a credit card, although kings don't normally do that sort of thing, but in this case, he would like to have one. How fast can you open that credit card? And they all laughed at me because they knew fine well that it would be finished before the end of the day. I said, okay, so now you know how fast you can expedite, and you know how fast it takes to open a credit card, and your flow efficiency is one number divided by the other. Another more generally obvious one to everyone is, how fast did it take to bring a vaccine for COVID-19 to the market? And the answer is 10 months. How long does a typical vaccine for a coronavirus-like disease take to come to the market? The answer is about 10 years. So 10 months divided by 10 years, there's your flow efficiency for virology, for developing new vaccines. If you have to expedite it, the corners you're cutting aren't that you're squeezing the work, you're just taking out the delay. You are improving the relational productivity. So you don't need a vastly sophisticated instrumentation to have a rough idea of the flow efficiency of your organization. That in an emergency, a real critical emergency, how fast can you get it done? What's the best possible time? And what are you typically achieving at the moment? Divide one by the other, that will give you your flow efficiency number.
Okay, another question. How can we increase trust and collaboration to reduce coordination and transaction costs between services of one in post-COVID world?
I think if you take a look at Kanban Maturity Model or our online service, KMM Plus, you will find a poster, an infographic on culture, and on there you will find a table of actions that add trust and delete trust. The trust is known in sociology as social capital. It's a very well understood and well documented field. And there's an entire section in the KMM book. We teach this stuff in our Kanban coaching professional training. So how you go about building trust, well understood, we have it documented. And what was the second part of the question, Lauren? Remind me. Something about coordination and transaction costs.
Yeah, sorry, I hit it and now, okay. How can we increase trust and collaboration and transaction costs between services of one in post-COVID world?
So Kanban's already a very low coordination and transaction cost environment. Replenishment meetings are transaction costs, but they're very small. The coordination costs are incredibly low because you mostly use the Kanban board. There's a lot of information on the tickets, not just what the work is, but its risk profile, how the class of service it needs to be treated with, who's working on it, and so on and so forth. So coordination costs are already incredibly low. Transaction costs are incredibly low. Working as an individual, you need to realize that you need your own replenishment meeting. You need to be able to meet periodically. Perhaps it's weekly, perhaps it's more often, but short meetings, maybe 10 minutes, 3 other people on a Zoom call, they happen to be your customers who are sending you work requests, and you've got some Kanban free on your Kanban board and you need to replenish it. And the question might be, which 3 things should I take next into my individual Kanban? So you keep the transaction and coordination costs low in the same way that you do in any other Kanban implementation. It's not different.
How do you address bus factor problem with people being responsible for unique things, like unique classes in the diagram you showed?
So that was certainly an exposure in the feature-driven development design, the idea that that there's only one class owner. And there's a related problem with that particular technology that certain classes in, say, a banking application, they end up being quite big. There's a lot of traffic through the class. Sometimes it's just messages that are passing through. Other times it's actual work the class has to do. And some of those class files get much bigger. Now, one of the things we did back then is if it got big, we assigned more than one person to own it. So that solves the, for the wider audience, what we're talking about is the idea that if you've got one specialist who knows something and that person gets taken out, say, for example, they catch COVID-19 and they have to quarantine at home for several weeks, or they end up in hospital or worse, then you've got a risk someone else has to learn that material. However, the risk is generally mitigated in feature-driven development because of the integration activities where there's code review. So when work is completed and it's been integration tested across a feature, that code is reviewed by the whole feature team. Therefore, the other people know the code, they just don't own it. They're not responsible and accountable for it, but they know it. And we could apply that same thinking, although often your individuals won't be entirely uniquely specialist. So say you're an advertising agency, do you only have one photographer? Do you only have one copywriter? Do you only have one graphic designer? Probably not. Now, some of them might have particular specialization or skills, or at my own company, we have people who specialize in things like Lauren, for example, who specializes in producing classes and webinars like this. But there are several other members of my team who are capable of filling in for Lauren if she's out sick. And they might not do it quite to the same standard and quite as professionally as Lauren could do it, but we have it covered. And I think that that's the same for most organizations. Thinking of your organization as a network of services doesn't expose you any more or any less to the fragility of individual skills.
Okay, this one says, how can we apply this idea when we provide different services? Will we need a different process for every individual service we provide?
So that's actually, that's true anyway, right? If the person asking the question is already a KMP, they should know that that's already true. In our Kanban system design, the KMP1 class, the first thing you really have to learn is what's the definition of a service, right? What's the work item type? And if you offer multiple services, you have different work item types. Now, how might you represent those on your individual Kanban board? You might use different color tickets. You might use different rows on the board. Is it a different process? Of course, it's a different process. It already is. That's not new. So we often use the example of operating a cafe like a Starbucks. And the work item types are espresso drinks, filter or drip coffee, infusions like tea, and it could be pastries, and so on, things from the cold counter. So customer walks in and they order a latte and a pastry. Two different work items, two different work item types, two different processes, all in the same Starbucks, all being operated by the same people. It's the reality that different work item types have different processes. If you happen to be, if I think about some of my own staff, some of them do things like copywriting, graphic design, and in one case, managing our outsourced software developer, the development company. Well, those are obviously very different work item types and they have three different processes. But do you need three different Kanban boards? No, you don't. You need three different colors of ticket or three different rows on the board.
Okay. Do you have any recommendations on how to best track people's time so we can calculate flow efficiency?
You really shouldn't be doing that. So, I mean, yes, you're interested in how long did someone, for flow efficiency purpose, how long did it take to flow and how much time did we spend working on it? But honestly, you don't need this to be very precise to know the trend. So if, for example, someone has 3 tickets in progress, so they're multitasking somehow on 3 things, it's not unusual. We get bored or we get mentally stuck. We need to take a walk or a cup of tea, and when we come back, we want to work on something else for a while. Well, if you have 3 tickets in there and something spent, say, 3 days in your working column before you moved it, you probably worked on it for about a day. Good enough.
Okay, this one. Do you have any books that you recommend in lieu of the IKE course?
The Kanban maturity model book, particularly all the material on, well, really, it's unfair to say just the material on maturity level 0, but we cover some quite sophisticated individual Kanban patterns there. But many of the practices you're going to need to have a highly effective individual Kanban are in the in deeper maturity levels, levels 3 and 4, for example. If you're going to develop a triage discipline, risk assessment, classes of service, understanding of cost of delay, dependency management, although some of that material is available in the appendices of the book. And Lauren, correct me if I'm wrong, but we've made the appendices available as a content download. Is that correct?
That is not correct. It's not
correct.
Available quite yet.
It's only for people attending the classes at this stage. So yeah, the Kanban maturity model book, but you don't need to read the whole thing. You could pick and choose. Alternatively, our KMM Plus service, KMM.plus, what's the current subscription price?
Until the end of January, it's still 48 euros per annual
for the whole year.
Yes.
So 48 euros for the annual subscription, and that allows you to browse 15 infographic posters and click on very specific. So you see something that's related to individual Kanban, click on it, it brings up the text from the book, and that it's a very good way of cherry picking the content, browsing it, rather than trying to figure that out from the physical book.
Okay, looks like we have time for one more question. So in software development, how would the discovery of features and requirements happen in this way of working, in your opinion? So end user customer involvement feeding towards the temporary teams. Sorry, it's long.
Yeah, that's a pretty big involved question, given that we've got about 2 minutes left. Feature-driven development's well documented, book by Stephen Palmer. You can buy that book still from Amazon. That gives you some insight. And the historical books by the later books by Peter Code, the one with the Legos on the cover, and the Java design book. They may or may not still be in print, though. One more shorter question, Lauren.
Okay, is it a good idea to measure how many items are developed per individual and why?
It's not a terrible piece of information to know the throughput of an individual service, and therefore an individual, and how many of any given type. The reason is that might be useful information for making forecasts. And if the lead time is thin-tailed, if the time things take to flow through that service produces a thin-tailed super exponential shape of curve. We've learned to call them curves now that we have coronavirus. Everyone knows how to flatten the curve. We don't call them functions anymore. Then you can use the Little's law equation for some very simple forecasting, highly effective. So it's not a terrible thing to do. There's probably not a lot of benefit in trying to compare the delivery rates of two individuals unless the work they were doing was almost identical. There are always situations, particularly in low trust cultures, where that sort of data can be misused, and there's a lot of skepticism. We see it in our case studies, the BBVA case study, for example, in the Kanban maturity model book. There was a lot of skepticism at the beginning, the introduction of Kanban metrics and how they would be used. The bottom line is that if you have a broken culture, we have guidance on how to improve cultures, but you have a broken culture, you insert a service-oriented organization design or the Kanban method, individual Kanban or anything else in there. It's not a magic cure for that. That's a much more involved and challenging problem, some of which we have set about addressing in detail in the KMM, and we teach in the Kanban coaching practices class.
Okay, unfortunately, we're out of time for today, but if you have a question that didn't get answered, please email us at info@dja.com. We're happy to answer your question and point you towards any resources you might be looking for. Yeah, so thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you all for coming. Thanks to Lauren for the production on this. Thanks to Anna for her support. And hopefully we'll see some of you again very soon.
Thank you, everyone.
Have a nice evening.
Bye.